Good morning, everybody. We will continue on the chapter about theories of demography. And I was talking in the last class about the first demographic transition in which we saw in several societies, countries passing through really high levels of fertility and mortality and experiencing declines, first in mortality, followed by declines in fertility, and reaching really low levels of fertility in more recent years, which in some countries, in more developed countries, we even see negative population growth, right? And I mentioned that most of the population will be, or has been already, concentrated in less developed countries, exactly because they still have much higher levels of fertility than more developed countries. And that's connected to those topics about projections that we have seen for the world by continents, which we see the population, the overall population in Africa expected to increase a lot by 2050 and 2100. And then in more recent years, demographers start to say, okay, a lot of developed countries, they pass through these really steep changes in fertility and mortality, first in mortality followed by fertility. So fertility reached really low levels. But some countries, we see that they keep having declines in fertility, and other countries don't have so sharp declines in fertility. What differentiates between those countries? So what these demographers here start to try to understand is what are the causes that make fertility keep declining in several of our contemporary societies. So Dirk van der Ka and Roland Stagge, they have been investigating, and then following them, several other demographers have been showing that the fertility declines are usually due to several different demographic behaviors that people experience in their lives. And again, that's in the US, that's related to the previous chapter that we saw here, and we are talking about contemporary changes in demographic indicators in the US. A lot of those points that we discussed are the ones listed here on this slide. So increasing age at first marriage. So people delay the age in which they get married exactly to invest on education, invest on their professional career before they form a family. On average, you see this increase on age at first marriage, increases in cohabitation. Of course, when people live together and not being formally married, they could have children, even if they are cohabiting. But there is a lower chance of people having children as a choice, as how people see themselves, of having children if they are cohabiting than if they are married. We also see increases in divorce, a more acceptable divorce is more acceptable now in cultural terms. But we also saw in some graphs in the previous chapter here for the US that the trends in divorce, they follow a lot the trends in marriage, right? So years that you see an increase in marriage rates, you see an increase in divorce, and you see a decline in marriage, you see a decline in divorce, exactly because people who have the chance to get divorced are exactly those that are previously married, okay? Emergence of same-sex partnerships and marriages, increasing rates of non-marital childbearing. So people that have children without being formally married, that can have the immediate effect of increasing fertility, but if those people end up not having further children, that can influence further declines in fertility. Involuntary childlessness. It's much more acceptable in our society now for people and for women don't have children at all throughout their whole lives, right? They can contribute to the society in so many other ways, then so there is not such a high expectation on women having children. But of course, that varies from country to country, that varies from community to community, and that varies from family to family, okay? But when we start to reach these really low levels of fertility, and we try to understand why in some cases fertility is still high, in some cases fertility keeps going lower, we start to see that these different behaviors affect the chances of fertility keep declining. And that's what demographers call the second demographic transition, when we try to understand the stage 4 of the demographic transition more in depth, okay? And then some demographers started to point out to the third demographic transition. So David Coleman further expanded the demographic transition theory, emphasizing that increasing tendency of low fertility countries rely on immigration to maintain their populations. So what I'm trying to say here, his main argument was that, for example, European countries now are experiencing really low levels of fertility, and also people living longer, right? So you have a lower percentage of the population below 15 years of age, and more people getting older. As these children in smaller cohorts keep getting older and reaching labor ages, the overall proportion of people in labor ages is going to be smaller than the older population. So that creates a pressure in the society and the economy for this smaller group of people to produce to a larger group of older people. So one possibility for these European countries would be to have immigrants moving into their countries, immigrants that are usually the higher rates of immigrants are for those in labor ages, so having policies that incentivize the increase in immigration, exactly in labor ages, that would bring labor into the country, and that would be a positive aspect that societies would try to deal in terms of their changes in age composition. So these changes, but when, let's say, a country that has been experiencing an aging population because of fertility decline and improvements in mortality, and then they start to rely more on immigrants coming to the country to work in the labor market, in their economy. Immigrants coming from other countries, it changes the national composition of that society, of the receiving society. It changes their culture, physical appearance of people, social experience, food, habits, everything changes. Immigrants, they influence the place where they're moving to, but they're also influenced by the countries where they are now living. And even identity, more subjective aspects of life, they all change when you start to have a more diverse society. And that has been experienced in Western Europe and the US. The US receiving a lot of immigrants more recently from Latin America and Asia, and Europe receiving a lot of immigrants from Africa and Asia. This kind of, this debate is still wide open, right? So what we see nowadays in the US and also in Europe is actually a pushback against immigration by saying that we should put more energy to provide jobs for the people who are already living here in the US, and we should also be concerned about our culture. And usually this kind of discourses, both in the US and in Europe, is really racist, discriminatory, and so on, right? There's a lot of xenophobia related to these anti-immigration feelings because it's not really based on data on how immigrants affect the labor market, but it's more about the perceptions that people have about that new society that we start to have it. So the third demographic transition, as David Coleman was emphasizing, was that now you have really, really low levels of fertility and people are living longer. You don't have enough people to work. How you deal with that? And then it was like, oh, immigrants, bring immigrants to work and that would be good to the economy. Daniel Lister, children of immigrants are the vanguard of the third demographic transition that will remake the United States. Children of immigrants are actually technically not immigrants, right? My children, they were born in the US. I'm an immigrant, I'm a first generation immigrant. My children are born in the US, they are Americans, US born. But they are second generation immigrants, technically speaking. But they are increasing in numbers in terms of percentage of the population in the US. Children of people born outside of the US, and they're becoming bigger in percentage, and that brings diversity to the country. But again, a lot of pushback against this idea or the suggestions that immigrants could help deal with issues of a shortage in the labor market, in the labor force. So some European countries, and some discussions have been emphasizing, for example, that one way to increase the proportion of people in labor ages in European countries, for example, is to increase female labor force participation. Still a lot of European countries, great proportion of women still not engaged in activities in the labor market. Another feature of some of these European countries, a lot of people, they stay in school for a long period of time. I mean, a lot of these public universities in Western Europe are free. So people just keep going to college, grad school, and don't really engage in the labor market. I'm not saying that we should privatize their universities. I'm just saying that there is a debate in Europe trying to make these people that, okay, it's good to go to college, to grad school, but it would be also good to create incentives for this population to start also engaging on activities in the labor market or working outside of the university, right? So all this discussion about the third demographic transition is related to the smaller proportion of people in labor ages, how to increase it, immigration, increasing female labor force participation, make people start working the labor market at younger ages. So these are all things that are in the debate right now across different countries by governments of different countries and policymakers. And demographers are always trying to understand this as well. Overall, as I mentioned to you, we see all these overall changes in population size related to changes in fertility, mortality, and also migration, people moving to urban areas. And as we get more data and try to understand these societies over time, we tend to concentrate on specific portions of these transitions. But whenever we try to understand, for example, what exactly is going on in terms of fertility changes, or mortality changes, or migration changes that influence urbanization, we have to keep in mind that all these different transitions are interconnected, right? They all are interconnected, they all influence each other, they influence age transition, and they also influence family and household composition. And all these different transitions, they impact how our society is organized, how our society is composed, right? So just a little bit about them. The health and mortality transition that I will talk a little bit more in the following slides is the shifts or the changes from deaths at younger ages due to communicable diseases to deaths at older ages due to degenerative diseases. So in past centuries, countries had really high levels of mortality, and most of the deaths were caused by communicable diseases, affecting usually people at younger ages. So infant mortality rate, for example, was really high. People dying before reaching 1 year of age, that was the chance of dying before reach 1 year of age was really high. And then as we start to see advancements in terms of basic public infrastructure, health services and everything, communicable diseases decrease in the incidence. And we start to see people dying more due to degenerative diseases at older ages. Of course, for example, right now in the pandemic, we see another pattern going on. You saw first COVID-19 affecting infectious disease, affecting people at older ages. But now, I was just looking at the data from the CDC just from these last weeks, we start to see an increase of people dying by COVID-19, even at younger ages. And what's going on now is that people who are unvaccinated are the ones more likely to die, as it was at the beginning of the pandemic, as it was in 2020, 2 years ago. The difference is that in 2020, we didn't have the vaccine. So those not getting vaccinated are the ones more likely to die. And since older people are more concerned with their health, the young people not, or younger people not getting vaccinated are more likely to die, right? So this overall pattern of changes from communicable diseases affecting young people to degenerative diseases affecting older people, that's the overall pattern. But we see fluctuations over time across societies, as we are experiencing right now. Fertility transition is exactly the huge drop in the average number of children that women have throughout their reproductive lives. So shifting from really high to low fertility levels. These high fertility levels, they were achieved when there was no control on reproduction, so no use of contraceptive methods. Whenever we have societies in which there are no contraceptive methods being used, we say that these people are experiencing natural fertility, no method being used to intentionally prevent having children. Into a more contemporary society in which fertility is more controlled through contraception, okay? And migration transition, the growth in the number of young people in rural areas will lead to oversupply of young people looking for jobs, and then they start looking for jobs in urban areas that have more economic development and better jobs. This is still true for developing countries, but such like the US, that has an economy that's really decentralized, we start to see jobs, opportunities, even in smaller cities or mid-sized cities. But you also know that in the US, some rural areas are really stagnated economically. And exactly, there are no jobs available. So young people who were born in those areas, they tend to get out to get jobs in other places, and usually in mid-sized or big cities, okay? So these are the overall transitions in terms of mortality, fertility, and migration. And they influence the age transition. The change in numbers or the change in proportions of people at each age and sex as mortality and fertility decline, and as we see people migrating from one area to the other. This is called the master transition because it's influenced by everything, by mortality, fertility, and migration. And it forces societies to change in order to adapt into the changing age composition. So as you have fewer children in our contemporary societies because of declines in fertility, and more people in older ages because of declines in mortality, you have the societies, the government, don't have to invest so much on, for example, building schools for young people as it was needed in the past. And we now need many more public resources and infrastructure to the elderly population, right? So these changes in mortality, fertility, migration change age composition of the countries, and then societies have to adapt to the new composition of that population. Urbanization, the urban transition begins from people moving from rural to urban areas. And then some people call it changes into an urban evolution, in which most of us, we live in urban areas, in cities. But then now we start to move out from big cities and start to move to mid-sized cities or to suburbs surrounding big cities, right? Because now you have better transportation and everything, so you can even live a little bit more farther away area and work somewhere else, or you can live in a mid-sized city like College Station, for example, and you have all the resources available to you, education, you have health services, and you have anything else that you can buy from here. But this is really clear in the case of more developed countries. In less developed countries, you still see a lot of concentration of economic activities in big cities, right? You see in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, a lot of like the major resources are found in the capital cities, not so much in more interior areas. And then family household transition, diversity in composition and structure due to longer life, lower fertility, old age structure, and urban residence. All these changes in fertility, mortality, migration, they make our families look different, right? So now we have smaller families. We're all urban residents. We tend to have our older people living with us and so on. So all those different transitions and demographic indicators change our daily life, places where we live, in our households, right? And then now I'm going to go through specific theories that try to explain changes in fertility, mortality, and migration. And here in fertility, I'm going to just focus on these three theories: the wealth flows theory, the human ecological theory, and the political economic theory. The wealth flows theory has a more economic approach to try to explain why people in the past had a lot of children, now they have fewer children. The human ecological theory has an approach that tries to understand the aggregate level instead of the individual decisions. And the political economic theory is not a theory per se, but it's more how can we understand the complexity or the reasons of why people want now to have fewer children. We have to collect both historical data and also more qualitative data through in-depth interviews with people and so on. But the whole idea here is why nowadays people have fewer children, right? And so here are examples of three major theories that try to explain that. So John Caldwell in '76 developed the wealth flows theory, really with an economic approach. Fertility patterns, according to this theory, depend on the intergenerational flows of wealth and services. So if I live in a rural area and my family bases all our resources on the amount of food and products that we have, that we raise in our little farm, in our little property. If I'm more this rural area, actually would be good for me to have more children, because those children, they could help working in my land to produce food, to produce resources, and that would bring more money, more resources to the family. So in that case, the children are producing goods that are transferred into parents. So there is a flow of wealth from children to parents, with the idea that children are help parents by working in their property, right? So when the wealth flows from children to parents, there'll be an incentive from parents. Oh, it's actually good to have more children. It's actually good to have a larger family, because more children can help us producing more and having more and being more better off. But then when people start to, it's not possible to get all the resources that you want in small cities, in rural areas. So people start to consider moving to cities, to urban areas. And when they get into urban areas, it's, yeah, you have more resources, you have better education, you have better health services, and so on, jobs that pay more. But at the same time, everything is more expensive, right? It's more expensive. It's in order to provide education to my children, I have to also spend a lot of money. I have to actually even spend money even with daycare with my children. So it's just really expensive to raise children in our more contemporary societies. In that case, in these more contemporary societies, the flows of wealth grow from parents to children. So when the money is going from parents to children, then there is an incentive to have fewer children. It's more difficult, it's more expensive, right? So parents we tend to have smaller families. And in this approach, the emotional nucleation of the family is crucial for lower fertility. You start to have a shorter group of people that you actually consider being your family. Now families in urban areas start to be more the parents and the children. Okay, of course, you might see another relative living there as well, but there is a nucleation of the family as our societies keep having fewer children. And parents become less concerned with ancestors and extended family than with children and grandchildren. We start to look at further generations, right? So here, it's pretty much an individual or household decision. Are my children helping me, working in my land and bringing money to us, so you have more children? Or I live now in an urban area that's expensive to have children, I will avoid having so many children and have just the amount that I can provide good resources, education for them, food and so on. So that's an overview of the wealth flows theory. The human ecological theory, and actually it was developed by Dudley Poston in this specific approach, the author of our textbook, and Parker Frisbee, who used to be a professor at UT Austin. This human ecological theory has a macro level perspective. Whenever in social sciences we use this term ecological theory, we are talking about the aggregate level, right? Whenever it's not the micro level, it's not the individual level, it's the aggregate level, the macro level, right? That's why it's called here ecological theory. It focuses on societies, not on individuals. So we try to understand why societies start to have fewer children by looking at the aggregate level information, not on individual decisions. So the level of organization and complex of a society is negatively related with fertility growth. As societies start to be more complex, more division of labor, and more time we all have to have good education, to get a good job, that all is related to having fewer children, delaying marriage, and so on. High fertility makes the population vulnerable to environmental, technological, and other kinds of societal changes and fluctuations. Right? So high fertility, it's, if you think about the individual level, it's more expensive at the individual level to raise more children. For the society as a whole, if you have major changes going on, or technological, even if you have a pandemic, if you have environmental issues going on, hurricanes, and some sort of climate change issues that the society has, that you have to be more concerned about having children in those places, because that can affect the whole society if you have this more, if you're exposed to these bigger issues or within the place where you live. So large quantities of sustenance are normally consumed by the familial and educational institutions. So in this case, on some societies, you need more resources to them. And in that case, the incentive will be for the society as a whole to have fewer children. I think that you could even think as the overall idea of the Chinese one-child policy implemented from 79 until 2013, around that. It's like the whole society thinking, we have limited resources. We have technological, not enough technological advancements to provide good for the whole population. So let's implement a policy that tries to control fertility. But also other demographers also showed in China itself that actually economic development in China had an effect on fertility decline. Now people move into urban areas, more expensive to have children, right? So what's interesting to see from these different theoretical approaches is that you should not think about these theories as fighting with each other, but as more complementing each other, right? It's, yeah, I can understand why people don't have as many children nowadays by looking at the individual aspects, but also at the society as a whole. Low fertility enables more sustenance to be available for investment back into the society, right? So that actually good for the society as a whole, having fewer children. And with this idea that to understand such a complex issue of fertility decline, the textbook mentions the political economic theory, which is not actually a fertility theory. It's an investigative framework with the idea that we should analyze the reasons of why fertility decline, both because of macro and micro level reasons. So in that case, I should collect not only quantitative data, but also qualitative data. I should interview people, try to understand the reasons of why they're having fewer children. And then he cites this example of a study in a community in Italy that they had data at the individual level that follow people over time. So they could see life course transitions of these people, changes throughout the 19th and 20th century, exactly because of the richness of their data. And also, they also had aggregated level data, not just information about the individuals, the families going through the decades, but aggregated level data, historical data about labor and marriage patterns. So this kind of rich data availability for these places allow them to understand that fertility reduction depends on social class or occupation of families, like using this more macro level reasons of why people have fewer children, But also these macro factors vary throughout different classes of people. So different individual characteristics of people influenced fertility, even controlling for the macro level effects. And the overall discussion about why fertility declines, it's not settled. For example, my previous occupation, I was a researcher at the Rand Corporation in LA between 2014 and 17. And in a specific project that I worked there, the Korean government, the South Korean government hired Rand to try to understand why in South Korea people are having so few children, pretty much like a little more than an average of one child per woman. So really low levels. And then if you just look at this overall economic data, you might not be able to understand what are the reasons behind why people are having fewer children. But if you collect more qualitative data, if you go there in South Korea and try to understand these people, you start to see, yeah, South Korea, it's really expensive to raise children. It's really expensive education. You have to have tutors, special tutors beyond the regular classes in high school for them to have a chance to enter in the university. But it's still culturally, I want to have my family going to the future. I want to have children, but so expensive. So instead of having 2 children, I will have, as a couple, we will have only 1 child, right? So there are some things that in order to change, to implement policies, to increase fertility, in order to don't have such a older population, you'd have to change the society as a whole, right? What's the name of that movie that recently won the Oscar from South Korea? Parasite? It's Parasite, right? It's really interesting because it's exactly that, you know, it's like the family faking that they were tutors for the richer family. And you see all the tension in social classes between the 2 groups, and even the smell of the workers bothered the family, the rich family. So all these tensions that we see in social class, the way that society is organized, so expensive education, all that influence how many children we want to have into the future, right? But I just summarize this. I mean, I now have children. I have twins, a boy and a girl. They will turn 5 now in April. And it's just so difficult to raise children. So difficult, so expensive that I completely understand why people don't want to have children anymore. So that's actually, I make it, it's just really easy to explain that. But we have to analyze it in a more general sense, not in individual experiences, right? But what we are trying to understand here is the complexity of the issue using micro, macro level, and join all these different perspectives to explain why we have fewer children as a whole in our societies. Cool? Mortality. Whenever you're talking about mortality, we are actually also talking about health, about morbidity, right? It's not just what's the average age until when people leave. It's not just about life expectancy at birth, the number of years that we should expect people to live if they were exposed to the current mortality rates in the country. We also want to understand what are the most common diseases that a population is experiencing. What are the common diseases that younger people are experiencing in that society? People in labor ages, people in older ages. What are the diseases that they have? What are the diseases that cause most of the deaths, right? So we are trying, when we talk about mortality, we actually have to understand both the fact of dying, but also the diseases that people are exposed to. So it's morbidity and mortality. And trying to understand that in the first demographic transition, right? The first demographic transition, the mortality falling a lot. The mortality fell a lot. Why? What were the reasons behind the fact that the mortality fell so much, as we saw in those graphs from the first demographic transition, from the demographic transition theory? What exactly made those changes? And then Omran, in the 70s, he came up with this overall framework to try to explain those changes, which is known as the epidemiological transition theory. What the epidemiological transition theory says basically is that we have a change from a prevailing poor health, so high morbidity, a lot of people sick, and a society with really high death rates, high mortality, into a society with good health, low morbidity, fewer people sick, and as a consequence, lower death rates, low mortality. So you move from a society in which people tend to have a lot of diseases, high morbidity, and dying at younger ages, into a society that you tend to have fewer incidence of diseases and people living longer. In previous societies, most people were dying at younger ages from communicable and infectious diseases. In more contemporary society, we tend to live until really older ages, and we tend to die due to degenerative diseases. And as I mentioned today already, this is the overall trend, right? Now the pandemic, we see specificities that make mortality transition not being so straightforward. There are variations. Now, this disease was affecting more older people, and now tend to affect people who are not vaccinated, independent of age, right? And it's more related to communicable infectious diseases, not to degenerative diseases, as we see in more contemporary societies. So the pandemic changes a little bit that. And that pushback against vaccines that's more based on misinformation than on scientific data contributes to even further high levels of mortality due to COVID-19, right? So this is just to say that we have this overall epidemiological transition, try to explain us what's going on, what the changes that the overall world has been passing through time. But we see variations over time as well, okay? And specifically about the demographic theory of mortality, also based on Omran, he divides the different stages of prevalence of diseases so we can understand what were the most prevalent causes of death in specific time points of our development. So you have a first stage, age of pestilence and famine. So a lot of people dying because of influenza, pneumonia, smallpox, tuberculosis, really high infant mortality rate. So really a lot of babies dying before reaching 1 year of age. And overall, really high childhood mortality. Mortality of those dying before reaching 15 years of age, really high. And the average life expectancy was between only 20 and 40 years. So someone with like 40 years of age was already considered really old in those societies. In developed countries such as Western Europe and the US, this first stage, they lasted until around 1875. So see, it's exactly during the Industrial Revolution, right? Economy changing, demographic behaviors. And then Industrial Revolution brings a lot of, we are able to produce many more resources with shorter period of time and a much larger scale. And then we reach stage 2, in which you start to see the declines in mortality. So that's the age of receding pandemics. Mortality declines due to improvement in sanitation, standard of living, and public health. It's not just the economy, but we also better understand how we get sick and how to deal with that. So we implement public health policies in order to improve the quality of life of people. And then the average life expectancy increased to something between 30 and 50 years of age. And in developed countries, that period lasted between 1875 and 1930, right? Reaching the third stage, as mortality keeps getting really low, that's the era of degenerative and man-made diseases, heart disease, cancer, stroke. Mortality declines due to medical advances in prevention and treatment of infectious diseases. Life expectancy exceeds 70 years of age. So we start to see that in a lot of contemporary societies nowadays. Fertility is the primary factor in population growth. We discussed that in the last class already, that most of the growth in our societies, since mortality is so low and kind of stable, the growth is usually due to fertility. Fertility increases, population increases, declines, population declines. But again, the pandemic, we saw that in the US, the pandemic just between 2019 and 20, life expectancy at birth declined by about 1.5, 2 years of life on average. And that affects population growth as well. But overall, you have societies in which medicine, doctors, science start to be accepted, understood by the society. And then you have vaccines being implemented. If you think also the time when vaccines started to be first implemented, there was a lot of pushback. But if you compare how these people were in the 30s, in the 40s, and how we are now, how much more knowledge we have about science, we should not be seen, we should not see so much pushback against these things, against vaccines, against the technological advancement. Oh, but the vaccines in the past, they were developed, it took so many years. These vaccines are all experimental. They are not experimental if you're already taking them, because the experiment was done before it went into a large scale. And what most people, I mean, it's a basic information that is like, kind of like, it's available in any news outlet. The previous federal administration, they gave billions of dollars to private companies. And say, we are having a pandemic right now. Go there and develop the vaccine. Here, money for you. Don't have to give anything back. There. And then you see Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson developing these vaccines really fast. And they say, oh, we have the vaccines. Are they going to give it to the government for free? No. Capitalist society, right? So the government, what has to do? Has to buy it. They pay, they gave the money for these companies to develop. Now the government is going to buy it. Billions of dollars. And all this money is like public money, right? It's money from our taxes. And these are all private companies profiting a lot from that, but doing the job. And then the government pays more money, billions of dollars, to get the vaccines. Why did it develop so fast? In less than a year, we had already vaccines from 2020 to 2021. Exactly because of all this investment, all these resources, in such a large scale that we had not seen, right? And then you have the pushback of all these conspiracy theories against vaccines and everything, but You just look at what just happened, right? And the crazy thing for me too, it's like more a political thing, right? Is that was done in the previous administration. And then the previous president had a discourse against vaccines. But the previous administration is that what made that possible. And people more pro-vaccine are more Democrats. So it's just like so much mess, so much misinformation. He could even have capitalized the development of vaccines in the campaign, and he didn't. I mean, it's just nonsense. But this is all to say that all these advancements in technology, political will, is related to how our societies develop and declines mortality. And it's not, it's how the US is organized, right? It's not the government who developed that. The government got the money that we pay the government with taxes, gave that to private companies. Those guys are really, really rich right now. And then paid again to buy the vaccine. They're even richer. And here we are, with people being misinformed that those are not good vaccines. And people dying now because they're not vaccinated. And then as societies develop even more to lower levels of mortality, we reach the fourth stage, as discussed by Rogers and Reckenberg, what is called the hybristic stage, in which we start to see variations in the chances of people dying or getting specific diseases more related to individual behavior and lifestyle. So individual behavior and lifestyle, they tend to influence more mortality right now in our contemporary society than in the past, because in the past, everybody was affected by it because we had no technological advancement, we had no vaccines and so on. Now everybody has that basic, and what makes people be more likely to have some diseases and die are related to individual behavior. So accidents, alcoholism, suicide, homicide, smoking, diet. There are a lot of studies in the US analyzing the effects on mortality of smoking and obesity, because diet in the US is so bad, right? So it's just we start to focus on the specific topics to understand why some people die younger than others, right? But a basic thing from the third stage, vaccines, is take it for granted in this theoretical approach, right? In this fourth stage here, when researchers were coming up with these possible reasons of people who are dying, they were not thinking about people pushing back against science and overall development in technology and our contemporary societies, such as vaccines. Cool. And then we go into migration. And before we start migration, it's just good to explain some basic terms in migration. Internal migration is the permanent change in residence that happens within a country. International migration, people moving between countries. And these terms here are important, all right? So if someone moves from California to Texas, and I want to understand the effects of a lot of people now moving out of California because being more expensive and so on, to Texas, and I want to understand the impact of this migration in California, I'm looking at the sending area. I'm doing an analysis about the area of origin, about California, and trying to understand how this out migration from California to Texas changes the Californian population. And the same migration flow, if I want to understand actually how that flow of people from California to Texas actually affects Texas, right? The labor force in Texas and so on. Then I'm looking at the receiving area, the state of Texas, the destination. I'm doing an analysis of in-migration. Look, these are the same people, right? The same migration flow. There's people moving from California to Texas. But then I want to see how this migration affects the origin. I'm doing an analysis of the effects of out-migration. If I try to understand how these migration flows affect the Texas, I'm trying to understand the factors in our society that are influenced by immigration. And more common, more in the national news, studies about international migration. If I'm trying to understand how migration out of Latin America affects the countries in Latin America, because a lot of people moving to the US, I'm doing an analysis of the effects of immigration. That's not really popular so much here in the US because the US just looks at themselves. But when you have all this flow of people moving from Latin America to the US, a lot of these people in labor ages, they could be working back in Latin American countries. If they stayed and correct policies were in place, actually that would be good for economic development of those countries, right? So that's why there are studies understanding what are the effects of immigration in descending countries. And what we usually hear in the US, what are the effects of immigration? What are the effects of immigrants coming to the US in the economy, in the society, in language, and so on, right? So those terms, in-migration, out-migration, immigration, and immigration, just be careful when you use them, depending on whether you are doing analysis of internal or international migration, and you are focusing on the effects on the destination or origin areas. Fertility and mortality, they happen in response to biological and social factors, right? Women have children due in part to her biological ability to have children, fecundity, and also to social factors. More educated women usually have fewer children than others. Mortality is also affected by biological and social factors. I just mentioned here in the fourth stage, social, individual behavior, social factors that might influence mortality, but also genetic. Some people might be more likely to die younger than others. Migration has no biological factors. A person migrates due to factors in the physical and social environments at the areas of origin and destination. Individual factors influence migration, individual characteristics of people, and there are several of them. So there are factors related to, at the aggregate level, the jobs, the overall jobs available in areas of origin and destination, economic growth, education that are available for my children, all these different aggregated level variables, but also individual characteristics. People that are more educated, they usually tend to migrate in longer distances. People in blue-collar jobs tend to have lower chances of migrating, and so on. So individual characteristics make people be more likely to migrate or not as well. But also aggregated level characteristics of the areas of origin and destination. If one area, we just see now, just starting now, the war in Ukraine. Russia now entering Ukraine. What you see in the news is exactly people getting out of Ukraine, getting out of the capital to all the areas in Ukraine that they perceive as being less dangerous, but probably they will start to move out from Ukraine as the conflict develops, right? In that case, you have this overall societal, there's a war that's going on, and people decide to move from one place to the other. So there's forced migration, right? Right now, they are internally displaced people, IDPs, if they stayed in Ukraine, and if they cross the border to other countries to feel safer, they will be refugees, right? That's what happened with the civil war in Syria as well. A lot of Syrians trying to save their lives by going to Turkey, to northern Iraq, to Lebanon, to Jordan. The same thing is going to happen right now in Ukraine as well. It's already going on. If you read the news today, people moving out of the capital first to more interior areas, and how this conflict will develop, this movement of people will be influenced by that. Why people move? Migration happens in response to a reason that the person believes cannot be satisfied in the current residence. And the study of migration determinants dates back to the classical economic development theory. So that's, I like to cite these studies like from Ravenstein from 1885, 1889. Migration is considered to be a mechanism that establishes regional spatial economic equilibrium, with the idea that if I have an area that doesn't have as many jobs, people will migrate from these areas into the ones that have more jobs. But as people migrate to those areas with more jobs, then proportionally, it will start to tend to an equilibrium, right? The overall number of people to the jobs available will tend to be more equal across these different areas. This classical economic development theory, yeah, again, really based on economic approach, it's based on this idea that people will keep moving from one area to the other because there are more jobs available in one place than others, and they will stop whenever you have this equilibrium. So it's more this mechanical approach. Or some other people will criticize that, say, no, migration will keep happening because of how our societies are organized. There is so much inequality, there is so many disruptions across countries that we will keep having those. I mean, I just mentioned the conflict in Ukraine right now is related to that. It's going to be related to that, to migration. And those kind of conflicts have been happening in recent years in many different places, right? Migrants usually move from low income to high income areas and from densely to sparsely populated areas. But with the idea about, we see a lot of like the first migration flows within countries were from rural to urban areas. But proportionally, the jobs available for people in rural areas, even with a small population, was smaller than in big areas with larger populations. Even in urban areas with larger populations, they had more job availability proportionally than in rural areas. That's why you keep seeing this movement. Population streams are expected to happen between the poorest and wealthiest places and countries. So people move from areas that have lower socioeconomic opportunities to areas that have better economic opportunities for them. Again, Ravenstein, he had these overall laws of migration. I like to cite them from 1885 and 1889, these two papers. They still are the basis of how we understand migration right now. Migration is affected by distance. Most migrants move only short distance. Yeah, as we develop modes of transportation, people start to move more from one country to the other, but still, migration to shorter distances, more likely than longer distances. Migrants often move in stages. As they leave one area, their places are filled by migrants from more distant areas. Every migration stream has a counter stream. If we say that now most of immigrants coming to the US are from Asia and Latin America. That also creates the reverse flow, migrants going from the US to Asian and Latin American countries. So you can analyze both flows. Migrants moving long distances often stop temporarily at major cities or centers of commerce, located between the area of origin and the final area where the people want to live. One thing that urban residents are less likely to migrate than rural residents. Also, rural residents don't have so many job availability for them there, so they tend to move out. But then in more recent years, what we see is the urban evolution, not just urban transition, urban evolution, as I mentioned before. Now we start to have in developed countries, even the rural areas are really well developed, have all the services that I might need, that people tend to live even in mid-sized cities or in suburbs, for example, okay? Migration is due not only to a person calculating advantage and disadvantage of the places where they live now and the place where they want to move. There are intervening obstacles that should be considered: distance, income differences between these two areas, job opportunities. What are the characteristics of the destination area that might be welcoming for me? Do I know other people there? Does this country that I'm planning to move to has jobs on areas that I could work on? Physical barriers and costs, migration laws tend to prevent migration. But as we're going to discuss here in the course, starting in 1986 in the US, the spending on border security in the southern border in the US increased a lot after the implementation of some immigration laws in 1986. And even with that huge increase in border security, what happened? Before, Latin Americans, or mostly Mexicans, they would come, usually only men, work temporarily, and go back. Would come in and go back. In the end of the 80s, when you start to increase a lot of border security in the southern border, these individuals will come in, not only by themselves, but with their whole family, and they will stay, because it's now more expensive to cross, because you have more barriers to pass. But once you're in, you will stay. And you don't stay only in states around the southern border. You go and move to other areas. So physical barriers that has been really a major topic in the media because of the previous federal administration worked in exactly the opposite way as intended here in the US, right? Increasing in border security in the southern border actually made more people come and stay and move into all different areas in the US. What are the other characteristics that make me more likely to move to one area, from one area to the other? Information about alternative localities. Do I know only about that big city in my state, or I know about other cities in other states? Do I know just about the US, or do I know about opportunities in other countries, right? So information is important. Personal characteristics: age, sex, race, ethnicity, occupation, income, education level. All these different individual characteristics influence people to migrate in higher levels or lower levels. Individual expectations: how do I expect to improve my life? That will make me more likely to migrate or not. So if I really think that if I move to this other area, we have a really good job that will improve the life being of my family, I have this great expectation, I will be more likely to migrate. Community and kinship ties, so social network. If I have family members who migrated to an area before, or if I have friends and they already contacted someone there, an employer that will give me a job if I move in, I'm more likely to migrate, right? So there are a lot of different obstacles or incentives that make people more likely to migrate or not from one area to the other. And as I mentioned about the fertility theories, I will show here to you a series of different migration theories. As I see them, I don't think that they're competing with each other to say which one is the most important in explaining the reasons of why people move from one area to the other. They are more complementary, so they help each other understand the complexity of why people move from one area to the other. And the idea is that migration flows are influenced by individual factors: age, sex, education, race, ethnicity, social network, as I mentioned before. But also, migration is influenced by contextual factors, characteristics in the areas of origin and destination that facilitate migration. The characteristics in the areas of origin are known as the push factors. What are the characteristics in this area that is pushing people away? And what are the characteristics in the area of destination? They're attracting immigrants. They're pulling people into them, right? So what we have to understand is that both individual and contextual factors influence our decision to move from one place to the other. And just a summary of these push and pull factors, the push factors, also the characteristics of the areas of origin, could be people are now losing their jobs in a specific city or in a specific country. There is an increase in poverty, violence, discrimination, low availability of social and life partners, such as we see, for example, in China, because of the really high sex ratio that they have. Catastrophes, floods, epidemics, or climate change might make people move from, for example, coastal areas to other areas. The pull factors on the other way: employment opportunities, education opportunities, income, better climate and living conditions. A lot of people being attracted to live in Texas, for example, at older ages because of the good overall climate, not so cold today, but the average climate here being more welcoming than in other places in the US. Different types of activities that are available to me that I could have if I moved there. So there are these different characteristics of areas of origin and destination that push or pull people. And when migration happens mostly as a response to push factors or to negative factors at their origin, so unemployment, poverty, violence, because of that, people are moving out, trying to seek better conditions of life. These migrants tend to be negatively selected in the sense that they tend to have lower levels of education and lower levels of training to perform activities in the labor market. And then we tend to have more people with lower skills moving out of these areas, the area of origin. We tend to have, on average, people with better education and higher skills. On the other hand, if people are moving to one area, not because their country is experiencing an issue, but because the destination, the country of destination, for example, has really good employment and education opportunities. So when migration happens as a response to pull factors, migrants tend to be positively selected. They are often more educated, they have higher levels of education, they're more innovative, higher levels of training, and the area of origin loses a valuable segment of the population and the destination gains from it. And in the US, actually, what mainly drives the migration to the US are the positive factors in the American society that gives people better conditions of life. So on average, what happens is that people that migrate from other countries to the US, on average, they are better off than the average population in their countries of origin. And then they come to the US. Maybe when they come to the US, the overall levels of education and earnings are not so good, but then their children and grandchildren will integrate into the society and it will improve their socioeconomic status, right? So, but understanding these push and pull factors is kind of the basis of understanding the factors that influence migration. And it's 12:25 now. And on Tuesday next week, I will go more in depth on theories related to internal migration and international migration. Quiz, the new quiz is open now on Canvas. I made some corrections to one question related to the world population changes, the chapter. People who had answered that question, I made a change and I added a comment on each single person. I think that was on quizzes 6, 7, and exam 1, right? So thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you.